This is the trade-off almost nobody explains to you before you buy an ultralight tent. Every gram you save in the fabric is a gram of structural margin you're giving up when the wind picks up. And in a real storm, that margin is the only thing standing between you and a collapsed shelter at 2 in the morning. Tent fabric is measured in Denier, a unit based on the weight of the yarn used to weave it. The higher the Denier number, the thicker the individual fibers, and the tougher the material. Most ultralight backpacking tents use 10 to 20 Denier nylon, sometimes called 10D or 20D fabric, and the most performance-oriented designs use Dyneema composite fabric, sometimes called DCF or Cuban fiber, which is even lighter and stronger, but significantly more expensive. A basic car camping tent or a 4-season expedition shelter typically runs 40 Denier or higher. One of the most popular ultralight tents on the market, the Big Agnes Copper Spur UL2, mixes 15 and 20 Denier silicone-coated nylon, silnylon, across its floor, canopy, and fly, which is exactly why it earns its reputation for being incredibly light, and exactly why gear reviewers consistently tell buyers to handle it with care. That's not a flaw. It's a trade-off, and it's one the entire ultralight category is built on. But it's a trade-off most buyers don't fully understand when they're scrolling product listings looking for the lowest pack weight. Here's where it gets structurally serious. Engineers who investigate tent failures point to a specific failure mode called lateral stability failure. It happens when there's insufficient bracing, an inadequate rigid connection between the poles and the fabric, or a lack of restraint at the base. In plain terms, the tent can't resist sideways force, so when wind hits the fabric at an angle, instead of the load traveling safely down through the poles and into the ground, the structure twists, buckles, or collapses entirely. A complete tent system has to maintain an unbroken load path. Wind hits the membrane transfers that force to the poles transfer it to the anchors, and the anchors transfer it into the ground. Break that chain at any single point, fabric tears, a pole snaps, a stake pulls loose, and the whole system can fail in seconds. Ultralight tents are working with a much thinner margin at almost every point in that chain. Thinner fabric, thinner and lighter pole material, less reinforcement at stress points, and none of that shows up anywhere in the marketing copy. Because the marketing copy is selling you grams saved, not structural reserve. This isn't theoretical. Clever Hiker, a gear review outlet that field tests shelters for a living, described watching an ultralight tent get completely flattened by a surprise thunderstorm that rolled through the Swiss Alps. And they weren't alone. Several other tents at the same camp went down in that same storm. In 2026, when Storm Dave swept across the United Kingdom with gusts recorded above 90 miles per hour, 2 teenagers wild camping in the Lake District had their tent destroyed by the high winds. They were left cold, wet, and stranded near Sprinkling Tarn until the Keswick Mountain Rescue Team navigated fallen trees in the dark to reach them. A spokesperson for the rescue team put it bluntly afterward, saying that high-altitude camping in a named storm carries extreme risk, not just for the campers, but for the volunteers who have to reach them. That's the actual danger here, and it's worth being precise about it. There's no large data set of campers killed specifically because a tent pole snapped, but what there is, clearly documented and recent, is this pattern. A tent fails structurally in a storm, and that failure strips away the one thing keeping a person dry and insulated in cold, wet, high-wind conditions. From there, the real threat takes over: hypothermia. Once your shelter is gone and your gear is wet, your body starts losing heat fast. And if your sleeping pad has a low R value, meaning poor insulation from the ground, that heat loss accelerates even further. In the backcountry, hours from help. That's how a gear failure turns into a medical emergency. So if the fabric is thinner and the margins are tighter, why does anyone buy these tents at all? For the vast majority of trips, in 3-season conditions, set up correctly and staked properly, an ultralight tent performs exactly as designed. The fabric strength trade-off is real, but it's a trade-off, not a flaw, and manufacturers like MSR engineer around it deliberately. They don't just pick a denier number and call it done. They balance thread count, fiber type, and fabric placement, using stronger material on the floor where abrasion is the threat, and lighter material on the canopy where it isn't, because where the fabric sits in the structure matters as much as the number printed on the spec sheet. Denier isn't a universal scale of good versus bad. It's a decision tied directly to how and where you're using the tent. A car camper pulling gear out of a trunk doesn't need to shave every gram. So a 40 to 75 denier fabric makes sense, trading weight for a fabric that shrugs off abrasion, rocks, and repeated setup without babying it. A weekend backpacker sits in the middle, 20 to 40 denier, getting a reasonable balance between pack weight and durability. But a thru hiker covering 25 miles a day for 5 months on the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail has a completely different math problem. Ultralight backpackers typically target a base weight, that's everything in your pack minus food and water, of under 10 pounds. And shelter is one of the big three, alongside your pack and your sleep system, where most of those grams get decided. Every extra ounce compounds over thousands of miles, so they're willing to accept a 10 to 20 denier shelter and the added care that requires, because the alternative, carrying several extra pounds for months, creates its own physical toll. Brands like Z-Packs, Gossamer Gear, and Hyperlight Mountain Gear have built entire businesses around pushing that trade-off even further, offering shelters in DCF that weigh well under a pound, but at prices that often exceed $1,000 and with even less structural reserve than a conventional ultralight nylon tent. None of these choices is wrong. The mistake is buying based on weight alone without asking which category you actually fall into, and then exposing that gear to conditions it was never rated for. A featherweight shelter built for a calm 3-season thru hike and a shelter built to survive an exposed ridge in a named storm are not interchangeable, even if they look identical folded up in their stuff sacks. There's a second layer to this most buyers never check, and that's the pole material itself. Ultralight tents typically use either aluminum alloy or carbon fiber poles. Aluminum, particularly the 6061 and 7075 alloys, with pole systems like DAC Featherlite and Easton Cyclone being the two you'll see most often in quality backpacking tents, is generally preferred for structural reliability under wind load because it bends predictably under stress instead of failing suddenly. Carbon fiber saves additional weight, but some carbon poles can fail more abruptly once their stress limit is exceeded, with less warning before the break. Some ultralight shelters skip dedicated poles entirely and rely on trekking poles instead, a design that saves significant weight but ties the tent's structural integrity directly to how precisely those poles are set at the correct height and angle. That works well in calm conditions, but it adds another point in the load path that depends entirely on careful setup, exactly the kind of detail that gets rushed when you're pitching camp in the dark as a storm closes in. The problem isn't ultralight gear existing. The problem is buying it without understanding what you're actually trading away, and then taking it somewhere that thin margin gets tested. A 10 denier shelter pitched in a sheltered valley campsite on a calm night is not the same risk as that same shelter pitched above the tree line with a storm forecast moving in. So here's what actually matters before you buy, or before your next trip with gear you already own. Check the floor and canopy denier separately, not just the tent's overall weight rating, because a tent can advertise an impressively low pack weight while still using a sturdier floor fabric, which tells you more about real-world durability than the weight number alone. Seriously consider a tent footprint, a shaped ground sheet that protects the floor from abrasion and punctures. For 10 and 15 denier floors, it's not optional. It's the difference between a shelter that survives a season and one that doesn't. Look for guy out points, external guy lines attached properly, add significant wind resistance for very little weight, and most quality backpacking tents include loops specifically for this. So if your shelter has them and you're not using them, you're leaving structural capacity on the table for free. And match the tent to the actual forecast, not the trip you hoped for. A 10 or 15 Denier shelter rated for 3-season use was never engineered for sustained high wind, and no amount of careful staking changes the fundamental fabric and pole strength you're working with. The lightest tent on the shelf isn't dangerous because someone designed it badly. It's dangerous when the person carrying it doesn't know what they gave up to save those grams and finds out for the first time at 2 in the morning, in the dark, with the wind already inside the storm.